for the last kind of 20 years, I've been involved in looking at social and environmental enterprises across the world, but particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So I have been involved in lots of different field work. I know I run a project called Trickle Out Africa, which looks at social and environmental enterprises in 19 sub-Saharan African countries, and lots of field work with various communities. And in particular, my most recent work has been set in Kenya, so Jambo, Boreaku. I've been working with producer communities, particularly women farmers in the Kisumu area in Kenya, looking at social innovation in practice. So I was asked to talk to two topics, and so I have some slides, but I'm not going to share them. I'm just going to work my way through them, and I'll kind of set in context what I wanted to say. So the first off, obviously, looking at the theme of the conference, before I start on the questions itself, I think it's important to note that whilst the conference, talks about social entrepreneurship as a route to inclusive economic recovery and growth, there is the social in the enterprise and then the social entrepreneurship. And I see a role for both. That it's, there is a massive social responsibility, I believe, for all businesses. And that talks very much to the first question as I was asked. And then there is also that particular subset of enterprises and people that we might think of as social entrepreneurs and social enterprises. And you can be a social entrepreneur and still work in a traditional corporate. In fact, I think some of the most effective people are the entrepreneurs who are social in those larger, more traditional firms. And in terms of the notion of social enterprise, drawing on my work in sub-Saharan Africa, I think it's important to recognise there is sometimes a legal form of social enterprise, but there's also a social enterprise in spirit. And that means that whilst they might not be a legal definition in whatever country you are in to define a particular type of enterprise as a social enterprise, there is still the ability to be what we think of as these social enterprises in a hybrid form. And by hybridity, it's really about that notion of bringing two logics together, the logic of commerce and the logic of social responsibility and social opportunity and social value creation. And so in my work, particularly since 2011, what I have found across the enterprises that I have seen and visited, and that's many hundreds in sub-Saharan Africa, is the huge value that can be created by considering the social element in business operations. And within that, it's really important to understand notions of context, which I'll come back to in a second. So if we start by talking about the first question that you asked me to talk to, which was the role of enterprises in sustainable development and poverty alleviation in Africa. Well, I think that's critical. I think that we cannot have sustainable development and poverty alleviation without the complete buy-in of all types of businesses, regardless of whether they self-identify as social enterprises or not. That if we look at the sustainable development goals, there are opportunities and places where every kind of business can play a role in trying to achieve those. And I think it's vitally important that companies understand how they intersect with those different goals, both from a positive perspective, but also a potential negative perspective. What are their potential impacts that they might have. I also see, and I see this particularly in the creativity that I've seen on the African continent, the opportunity space that actually exists for many businesses. When I think about the corporate landscape in somewhere like the UK, it's a very traditional and very old-fashioned and very hidebound, constricted space in many respects. But actually, what I've seen in sub-Saharan Africa is the opportunity spaces that exist, albeit often because of the gaps that exist in provisioning of certain things, means that there's lots of opportunities for businesses to play a role in addressing those gaps. And I've heard people talk about these gaps as being what we might think of as institutional voids, and I don't really like that word, because the reality is they aren't voids. They aren't, they are gaps in provisioning, but those gaps differ depending which country you're in and which part of that country. And that's why if we look at Kenya, there are different opportunity spaces or deprivations, whichever way around you look at it, in terms of the SDGs and poverty alleviation and sustainable development in different parts of Kenya. There are certain issues that are more prominent in one part versus another. So therefore, sometimes the business models that emerge can't necessarily always be easily transferred across. And that is important when we think about context. In terms of looking at the SDGs, looking at sustainable development and poverty alleviation, we do have to recognise that without the buy-in of all businesses of all types of organisations, we cannot achieve them. It cannot be left to one subset of businesses to do that. And we need to see an incremental shift in all businesses to see how they can maximise the creation of positive value, social and environmental and economic, whilst decreasing any potential negatives. And that's therefore, I see this kind of continuum of different business types that range from the more traditional right through to the charity sector. And that's where these organisational forms across this need different types of interventions and different types of support mechanisms, and have different kinds of opportunities. And you can see that there was a report I recently wrote for the United Nations on youth entrepreneurship, and I can send you the web link for that. And that looks in particular about how different types of youth, depending where they are and their own particular circumstances, need different types of educational support. The second question you asked me to talk about, and I'm conscious of time, is that of what are the best practices that therefore enterprises can adopt to increase their productivity and their impact. So I have kind of 5 main points here. So the first is this notion of agility, that we need to think about how to build agile firms. And if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it has taught us that we need to be able to be resilient. We need to be able to be agile. That we need to start to look at those companies that have managed to pivot quickly during this time period to respond. There have been some amazing examples of business models being completely turned around virtually overnight by companies who've worked out ways to stay current, to stay relevant, and to stay in business. So that agility is, I think, and something we should be trying to promote, agility and resilience within your firms. And within that, we need to understand our supply chains. And so those firms that have adapted and increased productivity and their impact have understood their supply chains in detail. Not just their first tier, but their second and third tier and beyond. They've asked themselves, what is the risk in my supply chain? Where are the opportunities in my supply chain? Where might I partner with communities, particularly, developmental opportunities to work with suppliers who are perhaps more marginalized, and therefore to spread business opportunities down into the informal economy, for instance. For those traditional firms, those that are more, kind of shareholder value corporates, to go beyond CSR, to go beyond corporate social responsibility as a bolt-on, but to think about how can we embed consideration of addressing sustainable development issues into our supply chain and our business operations. And particularly, there's some really nice examples in South Africa of social enterprises partnering with large corporates in mutually beneficial partnerships. And so these kind of cross-sector partnerships offer real opportunities to kind of address some of these issues. And within that, the importance of then capturing that impact. You cannot understand how to increase something unless you have a way of capturing it. So firms need to be thinking about what is their impact, amongst whom, and how can we facilitate the increase of that impact? And my final 2 points would be around to build on the culture and distinctiveness of African businesses. And this leads to this notion of context again. Business models, the environment, the opportunity space, the challenges that businesses face, they differ no matter where, depending what part of the world you're in. And they don't only differ between, say, the UK and the continent of Africa, but they differ across Africa. I think there would be very different situations if we were looking perhaps at Morocco versus Tanzania. There are things that are similar, but there are also things that are different. But the culture and the distinctiveness of African business is really strong, and we should be celebrating that, and we should be building on that rather than trying to mimic business models that might work in Canada and say that, yes, well, of course they'll work in Kenya. Maybe they would, but not always. We need to understand why they won't. And some of that is about understanding the specific context of where you are basing your main operations. And then my final point would be, don't be afraid of the informal economy, because it is, that is where the vast majority of households in sub-Saharan Africa earn their income. And this notion of the formal versus the informal I think people have to rethink that. They have to understand that actually the two are often intimately entwined. And we don't see that any more pertinently than in places like Kenya, where actually they talk about how 60% of businesses often source from the informal economy. So if we really want to help poverty alleviation, we need to be thinking about how to bring in the informal economy into the supply chains of the more formalized firms. But we need to also not abuse informality. We need to not use it as a way not to offer, for instance, decent work. So I'm going to stop there because obviously I don't want to overrun time. So that would be my contribution at this point. So.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Diana Holt. She has addressed the question of the role of enterprises in poverty alleviation in Africa. And she's talked about that we can create a huge value in the communities that we exist in, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. She's based this on 5 points when it moves to the best practices. And she's talked about resilience, supply chains, going beyond CSR, building on distinctive differences across Africa, and not being afraid of the informal economy. So now we move on to Professor Ranga Ziemba. Professor Ranga Ziemba is from Zimbabwe. I'd like him to introduce himself and to take it from there.
Thank you very much, Annie. Yes, my name is Ranga Ziemba. I am the Vice Chancellor of the Catholic University of Zimbabwe, based in Harare. And we have campuses in 6 other locations throughout the country. I am an organizational development consultant who has worked in a number of countries. My last appointment before coming to the Catholic University was in Afghanistan, in the Ministry of Agriculture, Irrigation and Livestock, where we worked with Afghan farmers to introduce to them alternative livelihoods of horticulture and livestock. And the idea obviously was that they move away from growing poppy, which is very popular with the Taliban. But at the Catholic University, my university hosts the Global MBA, which we run together with the Catholic University of Milan. And obviously, as we all know, the main thrust of this program is entrepreneurship. We have 3 intakes at the moment. We had a very big intake, our first intake of 52 students, and then we had another big intake, close to 50 for the second, and we'll be taking our 3rd in the coming year. My topic is how can higher education be organized in Africa, be organized to have a more inclusive approach to entrepreneurship for a blue-collar economy. one of our legacies in terms of education from our past, the colonial past, was that education was designed to produce graduates who would be qualified or who would be trainable for existing jobs. We grew up being told you must get yourself ready for the job market, but we were never trained to think about creating jobs for ourselves. And this really runs across Africa. And higher education in particular was never geared towards producing people who would work in the blue-collar economy. Blue-collar jobs were seen as reserved for people who would not have made it in school, or people who did not have the academic skills, expertise, but who would be good at using their hands. And I remember when we were going through school, we actually looked down upon these kinds of people. But things have changed. In Africa particularly, they've changed the world over, and especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, we are now in what is termed the gig economy. Gig economy is really characterized by what I would term permanent temporariness. Like a gig in a musical show is on for a while and then the performers disappear, and that's the end of it. Very few jobs now give you a permanent contract. We have contracts that are time-based or project-based, and at the end of it, you move on, just like gig performers. That's the economy we are now in, and it's taking quite some bit of time in Africa to appreciate this big change that has come about. And one of the things I am interested in looking at is how jobs are advertised internationally. There's one site particularly which my colleagues and I in Afghanistan used to look at all the time. It lists jobs, particularly in the developing countries, per country, and they tell you the location. What I have discovered now is that same job advert has changed. Many jobs now are indicated you work from anywhere. You don't have to go to Zimbabwe or to Afghanistan or to Kenya. You can work from anywhere. That's the digital economy that Africa is now having to deal with, and we are really not quite prepared for it. And I think higher education is better placed than primary and secondary education to do this, largely because the higher education does not have the same red tape that the lower do have. It's estimated that among the kids who are in primary school now, over 25% of them will have jobs that are currently non-existent. In other words, jobs that will come onto the market with time, or jobs that they themselves are going to create and bring onto the market. So higher education, as I've indicated, is better placed to make these changes, largely because university
Professor Zinyemba.
And in what
Professor, your connection seems to be unstable. We can't hear you. Professor Zinyemba? We seem to have lost, he seems to have lost his connection. So what I will do before he comes back on Let's just give a highlight of what he was speaking to. And sorry, still trying to get him back. But he was talking about how growing up, the blue-collar jobs were looked down upon. And that this has since changed because we see situations like constant entertainers and musicians who are highly valued, and they do not have, they have a steady source of income from what they do, from the talents that they have. He also said that the digital economy has played into this because you can work from anywhere. You don't have to go to that country to be there. And another thing that he touched on was that the future jobs do not have courses that are there right now in the university. So the children who are in the lower primary right now then do not have courses that they will study once they get to university. So what we're doing while we try to get him back, I think we shall move to the next speaker, who is Dr. Solomon from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So Dr. Solomon, please, what you will do is just go through your part, and then once Dr. Zinyemba has come back, then we will schedule him in again. All right, Professor Solomon.
All right, thank you very much for having me here today. The topic I'll be talking about is how Africa can transform the education system to make it accessible to all and reduce disparities. I think this is a timely topic which needs high level of discussion like this, because it is very important for the continent. And I thank the conveners for bringing this issue to deliberation today. Before I delve into my proposed solutions, which I believe will help Africa realize its dream of transforming its educational system in a manner that ensures equity, I would like to underscore some of the issues that outline the core factors requiring utmost attention and immediate actions. Studies show that Africa is behind the rest of the world in many essential indicators. The Human Development Index 2020 indicates that African countries' human development fall between 0.7, which is the highest, and 0.5, the lowest, of which most of them are under the category of 0.5. This shows how significant the disparities among different countries are and how low the human development is in most African countries. This calls for immediate action toward narrowing the gaps. One of the strategic moves Africa needs to make its citizens' lives better is investing in technology. In this era where technology is wealth, a country which does not invest in technology is one which has decided to commit suicide. I think 2020 has taught every one of us a lesson that technology is not just an option, but a necessity. In this regard, research indicates that a $1 investment in technology over the past 30 years has resulted in a $20 increase in GDP, which shows 17% more growth than the same amount of investment made in non-digital investment. A quarter of the global GDP is estimated to come from digital technologies, and therefore, given the shocking experience which required all of us to go digital due to COVID-19 and the future direction of digital technology, Africa has no option but to make heavy investment in technology. Not doing so, not only will keep the already wide disparities continue, but it will also let the continent lag far behind and pay higher price. However, the investment in technology can help the continent meet its strategic goals only when equity is assured. Africa's population has continued to grow while basic resources and educational access, quality and equity in many African countries either remain constant or dwindle at the worst. Africa has the highest young generation, which could be turned into enormous opportunity. However, access to quality education remains far beyond reach. The prevalence of COVID-19 has worsened the situation by keeping millions of school children away from schools. Africa has been challenged to let its school children continue their education because of the poor technological infrastructure. And far worse is by 2030, 230 million jobs will require some level of digital skills. This shows the need for investment in technology. Above all, the digital divide between the haves and the have-nots has continued to result in incredibly wide disparities in education. Students from low-income families are enjoying no or little benefits out of technology. In addition to the poor technological infrastructure and the digital divide, which is prevalent in many African countries, corruption, government's lack of commitment and loyalty to their people, and the bureaucracy also play prominent roles in denying the poor to access to quality education in today's tech world. Now, therefore, the critical question is, what can Africa do to address these challenges and transform its educational system in respect of equity? Equitable transformation of Africa's education system can be realized through strong commitment, committed, loyal, and innovative leadership and active engagement of different stakeholders. To my understanding, this is not a responsibility of one. It is a coordinated and concerted effort of the peoples and government of Africa that can make transformation happen. To be exact, the first thing Africa should do is to understand the magnitude of the problem in order to identify the barriers and position itself to find appropriate solutions to the problem. African governments should ensure that there is sound knowledge about the status quo, because it all begins from knowing what is out there on the ground and looking at what resources could be tapped to achieve the desired goals. This will serve good services to decision makers to come up with appropriate and practical plans. Such fact-finding should enable governments to identify the required resources for the development and implementation of well-thought-out plan and the improvement actions needed to improve the implementation of the plans. To be more specific, African governments should design and put in place favorable macro-level policies and legal frameworks that encourage pertinent stakeholders to work towards the development and creation of access to technological infrastructures targeting equity. I believe that Africa has intelligent and creative use which can be used in this regard. What needs to be done is to create conducive environment for them to exercise innovation and creativity. African governments must demonstrate real commitment and genuine loyalty to their people and work toward ensuring innovative schemes of getting technological divide to zero. African governments must make short and long-term strategic investment to technology to harness it. Continuous expansion of ICT infrastructure is highly needed. It's imperative that new strategies are designed to significantly reduce the cost of high techs and that of the internet services to make them affordable to the people. The experiences of some countries, such as South Africa, where telecom industries cut mobile data by up to 50% and made access to educational websites free of charge during COVID-19, is a very good example, which could be taken as lessons for future development of Africa. Finding out ways people in desperate needs have free access to technological gadgets such as laptops, tablets, smartphones, etc. is essential. Since having access to technology does not guarantee receipt of quality education, there should be well-designed digital literacy services to the disadvantaged. African governments should put in place strong schemes which encourage public-private partnership to be able to pool resources together to enable the implementation of equal opportunity to access to technology. African governments should work very closely with entrepreneurs to find new niches geared toward empowering them to achieve sustainable and inclusive growth. Last but not least, since information is wealth, Africa should enhance its technological power to create rich and dynamic data which will help it guide its entrepreneurship and youth development. Thank you very much. That is it. And I will come back during question and answer for further clarifications. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Solomon. Dr. Solomon has touched on how Africa can transform the education system to make it accessible to all and reduce disparities. And he has said that technology is a necessity, and a country that did not invest in technology committed educational suicide during this COVID-19 pandemic, and they paid a high price. He has also said that access to quality education has been worsened due to the pandemic and to the limited technology and infrastructure found in Africa. The digital divide in African countries is enhanced, unfortunately, by bureaucracy, among other things. And what he has said is that African governments must do continuous improvement of infrastructure and design digital education in order to be able now to transform the education system. Thank you very much, Dr. Solomon. We have Professor Zinyemba who has come back. So what we're going to ask is that he continue and finish up on what he was speaking on. We are so sorry we lost you somewhere along the way. So karibu, Professor. Professor Zinyemba.
Hi, Annie. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry, I lost connectivity earlier, so I've changed gadgets. I'm now on my on my cell phone.
Yes.
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, everyone can hear you. Please go on.
Yeah, let me quickly summarize what was left in my presentation. I had reached the stage where I was saying higher education is better placed than primary and secondary education to respond to the new economies that are emerging in Africa, the digital economy. And because higher education is less red tape in its operations. So higher education needs to positively respond and leverage on the new digital economies. And they can do this in a number of ways. One is to review curricula so that it is designed to produce graduates who create jobs, not graduates who look for jobs. They should also have a curriculum which supports the digital economy with all the skills that are required, such as financial literacy, computer literacy, obviously, and developing an entrepreneurial culture. And this, they will need to work with government in order for this culture to begin right from kindergarten, because it is really a question of mindset, where the child is brought up knowing that they have a role to play in increasing the jobs that are available in Africa, and in looking at what is possible in their own sphere. And in this emotional intelligence, education would be very useful, where we teach self-awareness to all our students right from the beginning, self-awareness which will then expose them to interrogating themselves in terms of their skills, their weaknesses, their strengths, and what it is that they would want to do in life. And self-regulation, how they can regulate within their own selves those disruptive tendencies. Once you get to know what your weaknesses are, you also get to know what it is that you need to regulate in order for you to be able to move forward. Motivation, being motivated to do things, not so much for what you'll get out of it, but for what you can create, something that you can set up. The rest will follow. For instance, if you are looking for income, if your interest is really in setting up something new, the income will assist, will come with good time. Empathy, being able to understand and empathize with others, understanding their feelings, particularly when you get into the whole area of business. And of course, last but not least, social skill, being able to network, being able to be in a group and reading opportunities and seeing opportunities as they come in your environment and harnessing them as the opportunities arise for you. So there is a lot. And then government working together with other governments in the region, because our countries tend to look for partners very far away from home, when in fact we could be looking at partners who are just close to us. And thereafter, as a bloc, we can then work with the rest of the world, and creating an environment that, particularly the infrastructure that supports the digital economy. All these universities and higher education institutions can influence policy in terms of government, so that government can work in this area. And then universities can also encourage the cooperation between public institutions and private sector, because the private sector, obviously, in terms of the development, will want education. This will assist in the digital economy, as I indicated. So in summary, I'm saying highest to the digital economy that Africa finds itself in, and this will then bring about a sense of inclusion in the economy which currently exists, because many of the students in our institutions do not have access to the digital economy. They are still in the mindset where they are thinking at the end they will be looking for jobs. Thank you very much.
Annie, please unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
There we go. Now you can hear me?
Yes, please proceed.
All right. So I was talking to Professor Zinyemba's last part where he said that the people we train, the children, the upcoming entrepreneurs that we train, we need to include financial training and culture. And we also need people who are self-motivated and self-regulated, who have the ability to relate and to create social networks that are necessary for them to be able to start these businesses and progress them. So thank you very much, Professor. So moving on, we will go to Mr. Dennis Kimbugwe from Uganda. He's the CEO of Pure Products Limited. Mr. Kimbugwe, please, you may go ahead and start your presentation. I seem not to have Dennis with us. Seems to have fallen off the net. So because of that, I think we can move to Professor Said Benama. Please go ahead.
Hi. Hi, everybody.
Hello, how are you?
Fine, thanks. Thank you, Annie, for having me here at this conference. Well, really, I'm very thrilled to speak at this conference on behalf of my university and our partner E4 Impact, dedicated to explore the phenomena of social entrepreneurship learning in Africa. Well, first of all, just a few words about me. My name is Said Benamar. I'm Doctor of Education. More than 22 years of experience in higher education. Today, I work as the Executive Director of Executive Education at the Université Internationale of Casablanca in Morocco. I'm the director of the MBA program and some other master programs too. I am a lecturer of organizational behavior and education at my university. Well, I had the chance to move through different African countries where I've launched different programs, and I've taught also in these countries. And I'm very proud to have served in these in Africa. Well, in my brief intervention, I'll be trying to answer your questions, and I'll be talking about the challenges, facing entrepreneurship learning deployment in our academic institutions as an overarching theme, and sharing some recommendation for adopting a comprehensive, transformative academic model to ensure sustainability of higher education mission. I think that along the last 60 years, higher education institutions have been exposed to intense pressure to enhance their teaching strategies to create positive impact on the learner and the community. And because employers and observers have been criticizing us or our traditional and discipline-based approach to teaching, we have seen the emergence of a multitude of non-traditional education players, including associations, corporate universities, and consulting firms, embracing the mission of entrepreneurship learning providers. That pressure has been intensified with the COVID-19 pandemic, with education stakeholders, prompting for more social learning impact. We all know that entrepreneurship is a phenomenon that expresses itself better in the context of crisis or disruptive, changes. The positive thing is that where there is disruptive changes, there is or should be opportunities. And now let me ask the following questions. Are our students qualified to seize those opportunities? Could they adapt to upcoming similar uncertainties? I might be a bit provocative by asking the following question. Have our universities been adaptive? And how do they prepare for the uncertain, disruptive future? Well, I'm not going to answer this question. I'll let you answer it. I don't want to be put on the spot. We have all been part of this, immersive experience of the pandemic. And in reaction to the collateral societal and social and economic damages triggered by the pandemic, we have witnessed the unprecedented wave of solidarity and social entrepreneurship that have positioned the human being and the social impact as top priority. In Morocco, for instance, to give an example, individuals, NGOs, and government departments managed to collect in a record time of 1 month, the amount of $3 billion to constitute the Solidarity National Fund. It was just unachievable 1 day before the COVID-19. In the same way, there has been a massive entrepreneurial initiatives from young students to design, new masks, to produce new technological devices for learning, and new respiratory machines for hospitals. So those heroes were not necessarily from the business world. They were just students, engineers, or law students, or health students, right? So having said that, what is the learning point behind this pandemic? How could we make this positive energy of social creativity contagious as a COVID-19 and make it sustainable? And I think here is where the universities and education institutions should come in, to assume the roles as enablers of entrepreneurship learning, or better, transformative learning for social impact. Having said that, we have to know that while entrepreneurship learning has been proven to be highly impactful, its deployment in academic institutions is very challenging for many reasons, some of which will be exposed instantly. In fact, there has been abundant research documenting positive impact of entrepreneurship learning on individuals and communities. However, very few have been written about the effective learning strategies from a practical curriculum design perspective, neither about how to scale up entrepreneurship learning at university and higher education institutions setting. So why is this? Let me answer this question by outlining the following analysis. Entrepreneurial or entrepreneurship success relies heavily on the mastery of two categories of skills, right? So the first category relates to hard skills, what we call hard skills, and relates to a set of declarative knowledge retrieved from the core disciplines areas of business, engineering, health, and that might include, for instance, business plan, a marketing strategy, value proposition, math, mechanics, and etc. The second category of skills cover what we call transformative skills or transformative attributes that are those behavioral skills that empower the entrepreneurs or the learners to behave and sustain the business on the market, navigating sometimes the tough and unpredicted reality of the environment, specifically, in Africa. And among these skills, we can cite, for instance, problem solving, resilience, teamwork, creativity, risk-taking, communication skills, and so on. Now, what's challenging about this is that unlike hard skills, right, these skills are content-free and should be developed through a long-time horizon, moving behind the course classes and using various experiential and technology-enabled learning tools. And because of the discipline-oriented tradition, faculty invested too much in hard skills and very few in pedagogy and education theory, which turns out to be the critical leverage, conducting to transformative learning. On top of that comes in the resistance of some faculty to get out of their comfort zones and embrace those, innovative instructional methodologies. So this is exactly the main challenge. It's not exhaustive, there are many, but for time, I will limit it to these. Now, what could be the recommendations or the answers? So some of the recommendations I'll be presenting in, a logic of thinking design. First recommendation is revisit the scope of entrepreneurship and make it more comprehensive to embrace, behavioral and transferable skills, which upgraded to be, applicable to all programs, measures, and why not compulsory for all students. Therefore, I think that maybe the entrepreneurial learning is more comprehensive concept than entrepreneurship, which turns out to be a bit narrow. Second recommendation is to involve the leadership of institutions to make entrepreneurship learning with impact an integral component of the mission statement of the institutions, with expectations to have it as a strategic theme in their transformative strategic plans. The third recommendation is to rethink curriculum design, especially for undergrad students, to align the entire program learning outcomes with entrepreneurial attributes and skills, which means designing interdisciplinary programs along with experiential and technology-enabled learning tools to activate them. This includes, among others, of course, the practice of action research, service learning, and entrepreneurship learning, while connecting students to their core discipline content areas. Teamwork should be the main social construct where students cultivate the collective intelligence and the essence of collaboration, which might be the human attribute, that can be ever automated by any technological device. Then the practice of a meaningful assessment is a key element to make sure that the process of learning has empowered the learners to make a social difference in their communities. I can add also as a recommendation to implement within our institutions incubators to support learners moving to launch their own business and drive institutions to collaborate with external stakeholders, including banks, NGOs, companies, and so on. Last but least, invest massively in faculty professional development, and encourage a research strategy in education that champion a format of scholars, practitioners, whose missions will be to enhance the practice of learning for impact. Well, I think probably I'm ending at time, but coming to the end of my intervention, I would like to state that these recommendations and answers to questions require expertise, courage, and distributed leadership to bring them into effect. If we dare to bring in these changes into our institutions, we would have contributed to the sustainability of our social mission-driven activity and exemplified our roles as entrepreneurial academic institutions for social impact in Africa. Well, thank you very much. My intervention comes to the end, and be ready to answer any questions of your attendees.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Said. Professor Said has brought to the front something that is very interesting. He has said, in addition to empowering the learners to make a social difference, that we also need to invest not only in the universities in their strategic plan, so that it's part of what they are doing. It's not something that is taught in the school, but it's not part of the overall plan. And to also invest in the faculty development, because when you invest in the faculty development, then they are able to transfer the information to the learners, and that learners are able to transfer their businesses and their launches and their entrepreneurial skills to the community. Thank you very much, Professor Said.
You're welcome.
I can see we still do not have Solomon. I think his internet went down. So, and I still see that we do not have Professor Giudici.
I'm here. I'm here.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much.
Apologies.
Welcome, sir. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you very much. Apologies for the delay.
All right. So please go ahead.
Ready?
Yes. Are you ready? Are you okay?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Can I share the screen as well or no? Yeah, it's sent to one slide.
Please share.
Yeah, just 1 second. So thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to contribute to this conference. And because of the topic, because of the context, because of the location, I've been at Tangaza multiple times. And I also like to thank the organizers and apologize for my delay. As I told some of you, they gave me an award 1 hour ago, and that was unexpected. Also, I had to change my agenda. So the question I've been given is, what are the practices, the best practices, the challenges, and the recommendation for pro-social intermediate organizations that will see an inclusive growth in social entrepreneurship in Africa? So it's kind of a very rich question. And so I'll try to unpack it a little bit in 3 blocks. So my short talk will have 3 parts. One is the theory, so what we mean by pro-social intermediate organizations. The second part is about the research, what we have been finding in terms of what these organizations do. And then the practice, which I find very interesting in the context of social innovation, impact innovation in Africa, and also with the collaboration with E4 Impact in several countries. So the first question, I will try to wrap, to frame my talk based on three articles that we published with several colleagues, just to give a sense of there is coherence in the perspective. Let me share just a couple of slides. So these are the 3 articles, but there are other more published also by colleagues and other people in the field. So the theory in terms of what we mean by pro-social intermediate organization comes primarily from an article we published a couple of years ago in the Academic Management Journal. And then the practice and the research insights come from a couple of articles in Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, including with data from Kenya just published. This is forthcoming, the last paper on the slide. So the theory. So let me spend a couple of minutes trying to clarify what we mean with this terminology. This is a part of a research stream that with some colleagues who have been working on for some years. Let me close. I think there is volume somewhere. Okay. This is a research stream we have been working on for a number of years related to the broader conversation on innovation networks, and now the actor at the center of an innovation network shape the innovation output of the network itself. And this is irrespective of whether the network is commercially or socially or impact oriented. In this literature, in the past, authors have been talking about how these organizations orchestrate the network. So, can you see me? Yes. So the authors have been talking about how these organizations orchestrate the networks. And by orchestration, we mean a series of activities to shape how participants in the network work together when conducting innovation activities. So as part of this conversation, in the slide that I'm going to share right now again, let me reopen it. We, myself and colleagues, we distinguish between two different orchestration orientations. So traditionally, the literature has been focusing on what we call open system, a closed system orchestrator. So the situation where there is a central actor, typically a large organization, a large company, trying to orchestrate a network of innovation partners and suppliers. And as you can imagine, these large organizations, they try to orchestrate the network in order to appropriate as much value from the network as possible, in particular in terms of intellectual property. But beyond the large firms, there are also large R&D consortia or government-backed industrial programs. So, but the focus is on the orientation of the central actor that is self-oriented. Okay, so it's trying to direct what others do for its own benefits. This is very, very different theoretically from the case of other organizations like incubators or accelerators or government agencies or even venture or trade associations that instead conduct a series of activities for the benefit of the network, so of participants in the network. So instead of trying to appropriate the value, they try to expand the value for everybody, and they get a little bit of the value in order to be sustainable, but ultimately their benefit, their output is for the broader, for participants and also for society. The goal in this case is other-oriented, and typically the output has a significant positive spillover effect on society in terms, for example, of inclusive growth, the resolution of complex societal challenges, and also social change. So in this case, the role of the intermediate organization is to facilitate entrepreneurial innovation in a way that is decentralized and diffuse. These actors, they do so, think about incubators or accelerators, by trying to support the building of better capabilities and resources for participants in the network. So this is the kind of theoretical underpinnings of this research. So let me talk now about what we found when collecting data from the ground in the other paper that I was mentioning about. When we use the term open system orchestrators as pro-social, we do not necessarily characterize this pro-social as meaning that there is a social mission. Okay, some pro-social orchestrators, they do it with a social mission, some others they don't. So from a research point of view, it is interesting to understand what happens when there is an explicit social mission in running a network of innovation. So some of the cases, like Impact Hub around the world, is a global network of social incubators. Present is also in Africa in several countries and is expanding. So what do they do when they have this social mission? Another example is Ashoka, is a different kind of orchestrator. I know that Ashoka is involved with this conference, but also for Impact, different kind of orchestrators that have a clear social mission at the center. So what is the implication? So some points that emerge from our research. First of all, the presence of a social mission tends to push these organizations towards early scaling because they want to magnify the social impact that they create. So the mission makes the desire to scale faster, becomes earlier than usual. And this push tends to create a higher likelihood of frictions in the scaling process because the business model of these intermediate organizations scale often at a point when it's not yet mature and stable. So that creates friction potentially within the network and some also negative implications, because when scaling faster with a business model which is not fully mature, there might be people or participants in the network for other countries, from other contexts, from other industries, with completely different approaches. So the very fact that these intermediate organizations, they strive to make the work better, faster, means that they also encounter significant challenges that might exacerbate the traditional challenges in scaling up. However, what we found very interesting in the data, in these studies, is that the desire to create the social impact can also become a force for good, meaning that these organizations, precisely because they want to make the world a better place and solve societal challenges, their motivation to innovate their own business model to get around this friction is stronger. And so we tend to see in these organizations different forms of distributed governance or shared governance, cross-country, maybe multiple stakeholder agreements, and so on, all springing out of the challenges in scaling up for social impact. So there are three broad tendencies that I'd like to characterize. The first tendency is a push towards decentralized decision-making. So when scaling faster, these organizations, they start facing challenges from the ground, from new participants. So they have a reason to decentralize decision-making earlier than usual. And not only that, but also a push towards shared governance. So the fact that there is there are reasons to make the governance mechanism more shared. The implications for these organizations is that unless these issues in terms of the limitations of traditional centralized governance structures are taken into account early on, the implication that frictions and tensions will keep happening in different countries, in different parts of the network. So the sooner governance is shared and decentralized with a proper mechanism, the better for the long-term sustainability of the network, and more importantly, for its social impact. So over time, finally, third point, the social mission also creates a push towards horizontal learning rather than centralized vertical learning. This means, for example, that some of these networks typically start with rules, activities, or they try to teach participants in the network what they should do for social impact in a vertical way. But over time, precisely because of the decentralization and shared elements, knowledge starts flowing bottom up from different countries and stakeholders because they are closer to the social issues on the ground. Therefore, the intermediate organization at the center, when there is a social mission, will have a stronger motivation to start moving towards horizontal mechanisms of knowledge sharing, learning itself from the network. So this is like the, if you want, the insight from the research. So let me talk third about the practice in the context of impact entrepreneurship in Africa, and talking about the work we do with E4 Impact and why we find it so interesting. First of all, this is an organization, E4 Impact, that has been pro-social from the very beginning, with a strong focus on educating the next generation of African impact innovators. So there was a pro-social orientation from the beginning. So let me briefly talk about the participants and the governance of the network. The participants, you know better than me that in many African countries, the lines between social and commercial innovation are blurred. So I've been talking to hundreds of African innovators. They tend to mix, to make the term social and commercial innovation overlap, which is why also I prefer the term impact innovation and social innovation. And this is because it's plenty of systemic challenges that require commercial innovators that feel the social challenge deeply, but also can find sustainable, commercially sustainable ways to address them. So if in many countries, like in the Western world, there is a strong polarization in the discourse between commercial and social goals, for me and my colleagues, it's fascinating to see how impact-driven entrepreneurs in African countries wants to make their country and their continent better, but also with commercially robust business models. And I think this is very, very important when we get to the theme of entrepreneurial education. And in the last paper I mentioned early on, we also showed that when these impact entrepreneurs try to address social challenges with a commercially viable business model. They also progressively contribute towards the building up of the institutional infrastructure in their country. So they do it basically in an innovative way to make money and serve society. And the E4Impact Network has several, they call them champions, but several examples of high-profile, impact-driven entrepreneurs with a commercially viable business model. And from a research point of view, this is exciting to research. Finally, on the governance, we've been tracking the evolution of the governance of E4Impact for now 5 years, and we have seen several of the points I was describing early on. We have seen the tensions in more than one country because they were scaling fast and therefore facing new approaches in different countries, different ways of doing education, different ways of doing entrepreneurship. We also seen the innovation in contractual agreements, in ways of organizing the network, in way of creating a scaffolding of the network, which is why E4Impact is still growing fast and solidly, despite of the challenge of scaling fast. We've also seen changes that are really important in the central governance. Originally, the network was university-led, and then it became a foundation, and then they started bringing on board multiple stakeholders, and then they started making the decision-making progressively more inclusive, and also started building mechanisms for cross-learning across countries and across faculties and schools in the continent. And we also, as part of this horizontal knowledge mechanism, for example, the accelerators, the new accelerator in Kenya that I visited last year, and now that I think there is a plan for replicating this kind of mechanism, is another example of an horizontal knowledge mechanism, because by helping these innovators getting closer to the implementation, there is also a lot of learning feeding back into the network itself and cross-country as well. Now, I do not have a crystal ball in terms of how the network will grow over time, but I can probably foresee the fact that the push towards even more shared governance, even more decentralized governance will continue, and the strengthening also of these horizontal knowledge mechanisms. And I think over time the network will keep building connections, connecting countries and ways of doing things in a way which is inclusive, but also commercially sound. And I think for this part, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Alessandro Giudici. I keep thinking I'm going to mispronounce your name. You have touched on something very important. You said about the centralized learning and the horizontal sharing of information, which is a big thing, I think, among communities, because initially when now people go and want to make a difference in a community, they give information thinking that they're giving information that this community wants. And then it begins to come up from the bottom, going upwards, and this is what is required. Thank you very much for that presentation. What I am going to do, there is a question that I need answered. The question stems from incubators and accelerators. I will direct it to Professor Said. Somebody asks that there is a mushrooming of middle-level institutions, including incubators and accelerators. Do these pose a challenge to the future of universities? Please answer that question for us. Unmute yourself, please. There we go.
Thank you very much. Well, you see, incubators are, structures that could capitalize or could inform or build on research or work done by the students, and try to provide all the facilities and supervision in collaboration, with professors, but also with, external stakeholders, including companies, and banks, to help students to incubate, their project within the university. And, research has documented that a lot of entrepreneurs fail, to launch their business because they lack in support. So the incubators at a certain period of time will assist or support the learners or the young entrepreneurs, at least to start, their projects. And then whenever the indicators are green, then they probably let them work on their own. So these are the roles of, incubators in universities. We have seen that in different, cases in the United States. We have a lot of universities, like Mason University, for instance, that have, an entire entrepreneurship center in which you can find an incubator. So you see, sometimes, just to challenge the traditional oriented curriculum, they want to create that centers, incubators, and centers for entrepreneurship, to have experts in the domain to help professors and faculty and students to support them in their entrepreneurial endeavor. Well, this is why incubators are important to have them in universities. And besides, as I said, incubators will help also universities to get open on its environment. I mean, these incubators will bring in to university, banks, and companies that will work together in order to find solutions to solve, solutions to solve, business issues or social issues in the community.
Okay, thank you very much for that comprehensive response. Now, I would like 2 recommendations from each of the panelists for economic recovery beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, because that is what we are dealing with right now. So how do we move this to the next level? I will start from the top again with Professor Diane Holt.
Yes, well, don't give me very much time to think about that one then. So 2 recommendations for responding to COVID-19. I think one of the ones is to, as we start to hopefully exit it, to look around and see what has worked. What organizations have managed to navigate this, and what is it that makes them different. There's a lot of talk about personal characteristics and all sorts of things like that, but none of that's really tested. So can we see any patterns in those firms that have managed to cope? What were the interventions that made a difference for them? So because they'll be much more context specific. So I think the main comment I would be is, what has worked? And then my second one would be, and how do we future-proof? Because we need to think about what can we there, and the 2 go hand in hand. Because if you can cope with COVID-19, as far as I'm concerned, you can cope with pretty much anything, because this has been and continues to be the most absolutely disruptive thing that as economic systems have ever seen. Short of the things like civil war, I mean, obviously that's a very different situation. But let's learn from what those that have coped, and let's ask ourselves, how do we future-proof? And in some ways, I'm glad I went first, because now you guys have to think of something I haven't mentioned. So I get to pick them first. But they would be my 2. And I think, and I keep coming back to this notion of context. We have to understand that just because it worked in one part of Africa does not mean it will have worked everywhere else. But what has worked needs to be noted, and we need to try and delve underneath the surface and figure out what can we take away from this that has general applicability, and what can we take away from things that might be Kenya specific, and to start to detangle a lot of those things. That would be my contribution.
All right, thank you, Professor Diane. Let us move on now to Professor Ranga Zinyemba. Please unmute yourself. Professor Zinyemba, please unmute yourself.
Yes. Yes, I have. Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, we can. Thank
my
you.
Apologies. My internet was a little unstable earlier when I was making my presentation. My two recommendations, the first one really is centered on the need to have healthy people post-COVID-19. And my recommendations is that the vaccines that we see now coming onto the stage be made available to all. I'm glad that Professor Diane was talking about the Oxford vaccine. And from what we are reading, it's likely to be the nearest to us in terms of what Africa can afford, and the requirements, for instance, storing at normal refrigerator temperatures, that might work for Africa. So my recommendation is that vaccines be made available to African countries like other countries in the world, so that people can then be healthy and ready to work. The second is that Africa should really take a ride on the digital economy, consciously riding on it, consciously working on it, consciously preparing for it through infrastructure, internet provision, assisting particularly the rural poor to take a ride on it, so that our development, economic recovery can be all-inclusive through all the sectors of our economy. Those are my two.
Thank you very much, Professor Zinyemba. So we shall move on to Professor Solomon. Your two recommendations, please.
All right. Yes, thank you very much. I'm glad that the issue of looking back is raised by Professor Brote. So it all begins, all right? We should first of all look back into how successfully certain institutions have overcome the challenges caused by COVID-19. So I think looking back into our practices, seeing how we have been successful, and documenting what have worked out, what have not, is one of the things that we should first of all focus on. And this is the first one. The second one is the yes, it is possible kind of attitude should be there, all right? So what we have seen from this pandemic is that it is possible that the world can have a serious and unprecedented, unforeseen situations like COVID, which kept everybody locked up, all right? And we need to prepare towards, coming out of such unexpected encounters. So the attitude that even when situations go worse and seem, impossible to overcome, people should have the attitude that they have the power, they have the capacity, and they have, the ability to manage things in thinking differently. So having the attitude that we can overcome problems that are facing us, and thinking, all right, different ways of managing the second, takeaways that I suggest. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Solomon. I will move to Professor Said Benama.
Well, thank you, Annie. Well, my two recommendations. The first recommendation is that I think we could no more afford, a piecemeal or silo-based approach to resolve the challenges of education, specifically the issues and the challenges triggered by the pandemic. I think we need a more comprehensive and a campus-based approach to resolve these issues. And I think that learning for impact should be a top priority for the university, that incites the collaboration of all the constituents of the university, specifically, faculty. We know that some challenges could be related to some efforts that could be done by one or two faculties, or in maybe just departments of business schools or departments here and there. We need that the learning for impact should be the priority of the entire university, and it has to get ownership of this, of this target. This is why, as I said in my intervention, it has to be an integral part of the mission statement of all our universities, engaging the university and the institutions to engage resources. And the second recommendation is to invest, massively in faculty development, professional development, because I think that we have to encourage a new type of research strategy, as I said, that promotes the practice of learning, and how we could enhance the practice of learning in our academic institutions and make it meaningful to the students and meaningful to the community. This is how we could make our institutions more appealing to the community, and sustain our historical legitimacy as providers of education. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, sir. So finally, let us move to Professor Giudici.
Thank you.
Give us your 2 recommendations.
Yeah. First, a general point. I think as a mindset, COVID, it will stay for a period of time, and I think we need to think beyond the pandemic. And Diane earlier was talking about future proofing. So thinking beyond the pandemic, I think, should be the mindset, because the pandemic is happening already, and just this continuous focus on the ongoing firefighting, I don't think is going to be helpful. So 2 recommendations when it comes to education and entrepreneurial education. I think the pandemic has, some of my fellow panelists were mentioning, has pushed digitalization massively. And this, I think, is a plus, because Africa is incredibly on the rise when it comes to digitalization in relative terms. So there's plenty of issues, as you know better than me, but there are pockets of advanced digitalization that could be expanding massively. And I think on this, Africa and several countries have really the possibility to leapfrog other countries that instead, like even in Europe, have been sort of lagging behind, to be honest, when it comes to digitalization in education. So one thing would be to invest on this at the government level, but also at the institutional level, and invest on this cross-country, cross-institution, because I think the age of silos institutions is gone. So first point, investing in digitalization for with a collaborative attitude. I think social value and impact comes from this will come from this in the long term. Secondly, I've been to several rural communities in Kenya, Uganda, as part of the research, and I think there is a massive opportunity to push digitalization towards the people in rural communities, and to help them become better educated. And even when it comes to entrepreneurship, I've been until 1 year ago, pre-pandemic, I could interact with some of the entrepreneurs on the ground. But it was kind of, the mindset was different. Now it's becoming easier, even mental, cognitively, for everybody to engage in this kind of capacity building exercise and sharing experiences. And so I think mentoring programs on the ground with local entrepreneurs who are not necessarily in big cities, I think would be should be a massive focus for the future, because there is a lot of potential and there's a lot of innovation coming from these local communities.
All right, thank you very much. I will now ask for our closing remarks, unless there are any questions that we have not addressed from each of us. And I will take this the other way around. Let me start with Professor Giudici. Give us your closing remarks, and then we will move from you to Professor Said, and then Professor Solomon, and then we will finish off with Diane Holt. My apologies. I forgot Professor Zinyemba. Professor Zinyemba?
Yes, I am here.
Thank you. I need your closing remarks before we move, sorry, your recommendations before we move to the closing remarks.
Oh, my two recommendations.
You gave your recommendations.
Yes, I did.
Yes, and then I forgot to mention, I forgot to mention your name in the closing remarks. So we will start off with, yes, we will start off with Professor Giudici, then we will go to Professor Said, then we will go to Professor Solomon, then Professor Zinyemba, and then Professor Diane. So Professor Giudici, your closing remarks.
Yeah, so let me thank you, Annie, for the organization and everybody else involved, and also the fellow panelists. You know, I come to Africa regularly. This year I was supposed to come 3 times if there wasn't for COVID, for research. And I found it increasingly fascinating when it comes to innovation and this kind of on-the-ground applied entrepreneurship and mentoring for entrepreneurs. I take my students to Kenya every year to see this, because I think this is incredibly interesting. And some, you know, I live in London, I teach in London. You know, that should be kind of the center of innovation, or part of the kind of where the money is also in innovation, at least in Europe. And there is so much to learn from there in Africa in terms of what people are doing to tackle real problems, right? And yet another, you know, small app for networking, which is seems to be the tendency in London. So I think there is a huge amount of learning, potential learning there on the ground where you are. And so for me, it's a great opportunity, I'm very grateful about the possibility to interact with so many of you over time. So that would be my sort of final remarks. So it's a big thank you and a big excitement to keep doing research in this context with, you know, some colleagues across the E4 Impact Network. And yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. So let us move on to Professor Said.
Well, thank you very much, dear colleagues. Thank you, Annie, for having us discussing this a very interesting, you know, theme of social entrepreneurship in Africa. Alessandro was talking about, you know, African countries. I've been also in Africa, and I've been, you know, very impressed about the, you know, the discipline of the African students, and to what extent they were thirsty, you know, of learning. And this is a really big advantage. Well, we are really, I mean, happy to be part of this, you know, big African countries. There are a lot of opportunities, and well, we have talked about, you know, cross culture, cross countries. We are using the word of a network, and I think Africa has the biggest potential, you know, to be the future, you know, of growth. And I'm sure that, you know, we've been talking about north, now to be talking about north and south. And I'm sure a lot of, you know, countries from the north would be interested, you know, in Africa. It's already the case. So our role, you know, as academia and as, you know, educators, is to promote entrepreneurship learning. Not only entrepreneurship, as I've been saying, but also entrepreneurial in a comprehensive sense, because the future is changing and we don't know what's going to happen. There's going to be a lot of uncertainties. So we have to work on education to alleviate the best practices of education, maybe to do less content, but more, because content and knowledge will be accessible very soon, you know, through the digital devices and by way of technology. But let's try to, you know, to work together to alleviate the collaborative processes and our emotional intelligence and our cultures. I mean, to, you know, to work for cohesion and see how we could make our African continent prosper. And I'm very confident about this project. And I also would like to thank the E4 Impact, our partner. And I'm very glad to announce that we are working on an MBA project, and we'll be probably launching a very, you know, new MBA program in Morocco, in my university. And thank you very much for having me here with you. And thank you, my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. We move on to Professor Solomon.
All right. First of all, I would like to thank Annie and your team for organizing such a very important conference. I think this has given us the opportunity to get to know each other and to learn from one another. So I thank you for that. A couple of points as a closing remark. One, I think Africa, as has already been said, has a huge potential, but needs to invest more in technology, more in entrepreneurial activities. So in this regard, it's important that the dots are connected. For example, schools, higher education, and the industry, the business and industry should come together to plan on how to run entrepreneurial activities. I find it very important to tell you one very short story about Ethiopia. Right? There is one ethnic group called Gurage. The Gurages are special community which are very entrepreneurial and business-minded. What happens in this particular ethnic group is that when a child reaches at the age of 7 or 6, he or she is given a task of income-generating activity to go out, do, and generate income for his own or for her own. And then when this child brings some money back home, that money will be deposited in his name, right? And then when he grows old, that money will be given to him to invest in better job, all right, or in better business. And this child will grow that, all right, very small, tiny kind of activity into a big business. And if you see these people, you find them everywhere in Ethiopia, and they are business owners. They invest a lot in the country, and they are, very entrepreneurial in whatever they do. So such kind of thing tells us that the education system has to get entrepreneurial education at lower level, where students are still at formative ages. So we should be able to connect these dots, all right? Bringing entrepreneurship at lower level, where students will build, the culture of entrepreneurial activities, entrepreneurship at their formative age, and grow, all right, with it, and become future, the future of Africa. And the other thing is building and promoting, indigenous cultures like this is very important for Africa to grow, all right, the way it should grow, instead of, copying and pasting what is out there, all right, in the other parts of the world, as Holt already said. And finally, I would like to mention that ensuring the sustainability of the private sector is key at this moment, because COVID has affected so many private entities, and many of them are, on the verge of collapsing. So there has to be a mechanism whereby these institutions get support in any way and revive, all right, to make sure that Africa, rises and continues to rise. So these are things that I would like to mention as closing. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm very much happy that I stayed with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. So Professor Zinyemba from Catholic University of Zimbabwe, please, your closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Annie. Like my colleagues, I wish to thank you and your colleagues for organizing this and connecting us in this manner. My closing remarks really are reinforcing what Professor Mengistu has just been saying. I know over the years we've had a number of mantras. One was mainstreaming gender. Another was mainstreaming HIV/AIDS in strategies, in education. I think the new mantra now, post-COVID-19, should be mainstreaming entrepreneurship education, particularly in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So finally, we move to Dr. Diana Holt.
Asante sana. So I want to first thank you for
well
the
done.
opportunity to speak today, and to join you all virtually. It's exactly a year ago today, more or less today, that I returned from Kenya on my last fieldwork, and I actually had a great hospitality in Kenya. I wasn't very well, and I actually ended up in a Kenyan hospital for 2 days, and had the most amazing care. You know, I miss coming back to Kenya dearly this year. So it has been a great joy to be able to visit with you today in this way, but also to meet new friends from other parts of Africa, some places of which I've been to before, and some I haven't, and look forward to in the future. So I suppose my final remark, if we focus in on entrepreneurship education, would be something that I've been thinking a lot about. I've put the link to the United Nations DESA report that I wrote for them on youth entrepreneurship. And that's the need to be inclusive in our entrepreneurship education. And I'll give you, if you indulge me 1 sec, what I think is a good example. So if we think about encouraging women entrepreneurs, there's a great deal of difference between a 22-year-old Kenyan woman who lives in Nairobi, who completed her university education and comes from a middle-class family that has financial support, compared to a 22-year-old Kenyan woman who lives in a rural community with no access to transport, perhaps with young children who never fully finished high school. And whilst we might think of entrepreneurship, you know, women's entrepreneurship education would be appropriate to both of them, they would need very different kinds of initiatives and interventions. And I think it's important to recognise that we need to think about how we can be inclusive to everybody. And then my other comment would be about one of the overwhelming characteristics that I've always taken away when I travel across Africa is how this notion of copying things. So how I've seen these amazing ideas kind of be distributed across the continent. Often, I don't know how, but, you know, and this notion of how you can, you know, mimic things and take them to other places. So whilst I think we need to avoid the trap of copying things that came from the global north without questioning their applicability on the African continent, I also would urge us all to look towards what's happening across Africa and look for the opportunities that exist that can be copied and transferred into other parts of Africa. So it isn't always about coming up with the unique idea. It's sometimes about coming up with the idea that is different to what's already there, but may be quite common somewhere else. So they would be my two things that I would say as my closing remarks with in the context of entrepreneurship education is the importance to be inclusive for those that are excluded so much from the digital age, that are excluded by the nature of, you know, how they've grown up and their access to resources and their access to education, and not to take a blanket approach and say, oh, just because, you know, it's all about women and therefore they're both women, so they can both be treated the same. And then to think about what we can take from elsewhere and successfully import across Africa. And that would be my summary comments. So thank you very much again. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you, Dr. Holt. Thank you all. Thank you to the panelists for being here today. It is said that education is what is left after what we have learned is forgotten. And what we carry with us to the communities is what we actually remember. You have all provided very good insights into how we should carry this forward. One of the things I have learned from COVID-19 was that there will come a time you will think that this is the end, but it is only the beginning. So for me, this has been a beginning of very many beginnings. Beginning of online meetings, beginnings of working from home, beginnings of looking for ways for things to be different. And I thank you all for making sure that the education that we have today, then we can replicate and we can take to the communities in Africa and in our countries. Thank you very much. With that said, I wish you well. I wish you a good evening. Take a glass of warm water. I'm sure your voice is parched. And we shall see you in another forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Kwaheri.
Thank you very much, Ellie.
Thank you
you.
very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.